In the previous video, we had an introduction to what is a business object processing framework, and now we will go ahead with the hands-on development of uh, creating a custom business object. So before we go ahead and create a custom business object, let's understand the scenario that we are going to create and what are the nodes that we are going to develop as part of that scenario. So let's take a real life example. So everything in SAP, they are referenced in terms of a document. For example, we have different document types like we have sales order document, purchase order document, invoice document, and so on. So if you take this information about this document, they are rather split into multiple tables, which SAP normalizes for the easier access. So now we will take an example of an invoice document. We will see what are the things that are represented in the invoice document and how we would generally split them into different tables and store it into SAP. So if you take an invoice document for an example, you would be having some information about the invoice document itself, which we generally represent it as a header information. For example, you have the invoice number and what is the invoice date, what is the status of the invoice, what is the total amount of the invoice, and so on. So these are some of the header information about the invoice. Now, this invoice could have association to several entities. For example, when you create an invoice, you would be creating this invoice against a particular customer. He would be having a particular bill to address, or he would be having a particular ship to party or a different shipping address. So you will be creating an association with this uh, different customers, so which in general we call it as a business partners in SAP. So you'll be having a header node which will contain the header information, and then you'll be having an association to a customer node where you'll be representing the customer information, from where you will be getting the details of the customer, what is his name, what is his shipping address, and so on. Then we will then for the invoice document that we have created, in most generally we would be having this invoice item details, where it is itemized split up of your invoice document, which represent like what are the different products that you have sold, what is the quantity, what is the price of it, what is the net amount, and so on. So these are the some of the information that we represent it as an item level information. So in general in SAP we will be having this item tables where we'll be storing this item information. So now let us go ahead and create a simple business object which handles the functionality of this invoice document. So we might end up in creating three different nodes, where I would be creating a node for header details to store the header informations like what is the invoice document number, what is the status, what is the invoice date, and so on. Then we would be having an association with that invoice document representing this business partner was used in this particular invoice. And then you would be having an association with the item details, where for this particular invoice document, these are the breakup of different items that we have. So to simplify our example, I'm just going to have two nodes to just for the sake of simplicity, we are going to have the header node and item node. So all the information we'll put it into the header node, and whatever the item level information we'll be putting it into the item node. So when we are going to develop our business object, we will be developing two different nodes. One is going to be invoice header and other is going to be invoice document. So when we create this node in our business object, we are going to classify the data into two different categories. One, we are going to call it as a persistent data, and other we are going to call it as a transient data. So what is the difference between this persistent data and a transient data? So in general, whatever the information that you store inside your database table to persist over a period of time is what you're going to call it as a persistent data. So it means like that the information that you're going to store in the data, it's going to be permanently available in your system. Say for example, when you create an invoice document, you're going to store the invoice document number, against which customer it was created, what is the date what was created, and then you'll be having the status, which you'll be updating when the status changes, and what is the payment date in which the invoice has been paid, and so on. So these are the information that you will be uh, storing it permanently in your database table. whereas some information which might be needed for the display but not necessarily required to be stored in your backend system. For example, let's say for example, when I'm displaying this invoice document along with the customer, I may also wanted to display the customer name as well. Now there is no point in storing this customer name inside your database table that you're going to develop. The point is the customer master is already going to have this information stored in some other table. Let's say for example, a customer table KNA1. You will be having the different details of the customer there, and then you'll be having the address details of the customer in ADRC table and so on. So this information is already available and there is no point in storing them once again. Instead, you can calculate them on the fly. So you can just read the invoice document, what is the customer against which it was created, and then you read the required information about the customer from the customer master. So this type of information, you don't really need to store it in the database table, but instead you calculate them on the fly. So these are just a temporary data that exist only as long as your application program is running. So this type of data is what you're going to call it as a transient data. So for our header example, we are not going to store our customer name. We will be reading it uh, based on the customer number. Then apart from that, other informations like what is the net amount, tax amount, freight charges, the overall gross amount. So these are something that we'll be calculating on the fly based upon the items and the quantity, rather than we store it in the database and then we retrieve it later on. Then we are going to create another node for the invoice items, where in the invoice item we'll be storing the invoice item as an association to the invoice header, where you'll be representing this is the invoice number for which you have this different items, like item 1 is this, item 2 is this. So you'll be having the invoice number and item number, and then what is the material that you have sold, what is the quantity. Apart from that, the other information which can be calculated, like material description, price and amount, we are going to keep them as a transient data. So based on this information, this is the scenario that we are going to develop as a custom business object. So we will go to the system and we will start developing our business object, and then we will start adding the different node elements as and when we develop the business object. Thanks for watching.